Madame Jeanne du Barry, the last great royal mistress of France. Jeanne du Barry clawed her way up from the illegitimate daughter of a single mother to one of the most celebrated courtesans in Paris, to the final royal mistress of King Louis XV. Her captivating life has been dramatized in numerous operas, films, and television shows, most recently in the new movie written, directed, and starring Maïwenn, and featuring Johnny Depp as King Louis. Today we'll meet the real Jeanne du Barry, learn about her diamond-studded life at Versailles, and find out what happened after the final frame of the film, when the revolution caught up with France's last great royal mistress. Jeanne Bécu was born on August 19, 1743, in the town of Versailles in northeastern France. Her mother, Anne, was a 30-year-old, unmarried seamstress. It's not clear who Jeanne's father was, but there were rumors that he was a local friar. Despite this inauspicious beginning, Anne soon found a way to provide a better life for herself and her daughter. She made the acquaintance of, had an affair with, Monsieur de Monceau, a wealthy supplier to the royal army. He took Anne and her 3-year-old daughter to Paris and installed them in the home of his mistress, Francesca. In this awkward arrangement, Anne worked as a cook under the watchful eye of her lover's jealous mistress. De Monceau still managed to find his way to the kitchens, and Anne gave birth to a second child, Claude. But their assignations became less frequent as Francesca kept a close watch on them. Meanwhile, little Jeanne became a pet to Madame Francesca. She pampered her with attention and fine clothes. When guests came to call, the adorable child was paraded out to sing and dance. Jeanne soon learned that through her beauty, charm, and talent, she had the ability to captivate. Francesca offered to fund Jeanne's education, and she went to a convent school. There, middle-class girls were instructed in domestic skills and religion, and brought up to be good wives and mothers. But they were also taught the more refined skills of music and art. Jeanne had a talent for drawing, which she would enjoy for the rest of her life. She completed her education at 15, but that year her mother was evicted from de Monceau's home. Jeanne sold trinkets on the streets of Paris to provide for herself and her mother, but her aunt feared that the beautiful teenager would get into trouble. She pulled strings to get her a more stable job as an assistant to a hairdresser, Lametz, who created elaborate powdered styles for the wealthy. In this role, Jeanne's artistic flair flourished, and Lametz became infatuated with her. He moved her into his luxurious apartment, and they may have had a daughter together, who either died young or was given up for adoption. When Lametz's mother came to visit, she was furious that her son had squandered his income on a working-class girl, and she cast Jeanne out. She next found employment as a companion to an elderly widow, Madame de Legrand. Madame soon received many calls from society friends, especially men whom she hadn't seen in years. Her 2 wayward sons also suddenly became much more attentive to their mother. When Madame realized that they were both competing to seduce her young companion, she was furious and threw Jeanne out. But the stunning teenager with thick blonde ringlets and almond-shaped violet-blue eyes had now made many acquaintances among the well-to-do men of Paris, and one of them set her up with a job as a milliner's assistant in à la Toilette, one of the top fashion houses in Paris. Jeanne thrived in the shop and attracted many wealthy clients. Bankers and merchants fawned over her and presented her with costly gifts. She received several offers to become a kept mistress, but she refused to settle and continually set her sights higher. Jeanne became good friends with the owner's daughter, Adelaide la Belle Guillard, one of the great painters of the era. When she was 20, Jeanne and Adelaide were invited to attend the unveiling of a new equestrian statue of King Louis XV. The splendid event included mock battles on the Seine, fireworks, and meat given out to the poor. There, Jeanne mixed with genuine aristocrats and caught the attention of Jean-Baptiste du Barry. He had abandoned his wife and son at his country chateau for a life of dazzling debauchery in Paris. He was so notorious as a card shark and seducer that he earned the nickname La Roue, or the Rake. He funded his lavish lifestyle by procuring pretty young shopgirls and actresses and pimping them out to the nobility. He and his brother, Guillaume, owned a popular casino brothel, which was frequented by the Parisian elite. Jean-Baptiste saw great potential in Jeanne, moved her into his home, showered her with fine clothes and jewels, and launched her career as a courtesan among the highest echelon of society. She brought her mother, Anne, along with her, the former cook now dressed in silk and had servants of her own. For 5 years, Jeanne built up an impressive list of clients, the who's who of government ministers and royal courtiers. She entertained them with her beauty and wit, and encouraged them to spend liberally on champagne and gifts, and lose their money at her benefactor's casino. Jean-Baptiste wanted to gain a place for his teenage son at the royal court. To this end, he cultivated a friendship with the 70-year-old Duc de Richelieu. In exchange for his son's job, Jean-Baptiste sold Jeanne to the Duke. She was given 1,200 livres for her compliance, about $30,000 today. Jeanne was not unhappy with this arrangement. The Duke facilitated her biggest step up yet by taking her to the Palace of Versailles. There, she finally met the greatest potential client in the land, King Louis XV. Louis was the great-grandson of famed Sun King Louis XIV, who controlled France with his enormous ego. By commanding all the nobles to come to his splendid palace at Versailles and compete for his attention, he controlled them all. His son, Louis le Grand Dauphin, died of smallpox at 49, and his grandson, Louis le Petit Dauphin, died of measles at 29. So when Louis XIV finally died at 76, his throne went to his great-grandson, who was crowned King Louis XV at the age of 5. His grand-uncle ruled while he finished growing up. But at 13, Louis took the reins of power. He was just as brilliant as his predecessor. But where Louis XIV had been proud, Louis XV was shy and modest. He sought the advice of others even when he understood the situation better than they did. His sole vice was women. At 15, he was married to Polish princess Maria Leczinska, and she gave birth to 10 children. Early in their marriage, Louis was very much in love with Marie, but as she was nearly always pregnant, he began to look elsewhere. His first official mistresses were a set of 3 sisters. First, he made Louise Julie a duchess, but while she was pregnant, he busied himself with her sister, Pauline Félicité. She died in childbirth, and he moved on to the youngest sister, Diane Adelaide. She refused to become his mistress unless he kicked her older sister out of Versailles. Louis's longest extramarital relationship with Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, Marquise de Pompadour, lasted for 19 years. She was his closest advisor, and he believed that only she loved him enough to tell him the truth. But her advice was not always solid. She instigated the downfall of competent ministers and had them replaced with incompetent ones. They led France into a number of disastrous and expensive wars, which weakened the economy and the monarchy's reputation. Following defeat in the 7 Years' War, France was forced to hand over New France, aka Canada, to Great Britain. Madame de Pompadour suffered 3 miscarriages and other health problems, so 5 years into their romance, she ended their sexual relationship. His devoted friendship kept her in the position of maîtresse en titre, or official royal mistress, for another 14 years. But she selected a rotation of new playmates for the king and ensured that they would be beautiful but silly young women who would not attempt to usurp her place as his intellectual companion. French kings were expected to prove their virility by surrounding themselves with dazzling mistresses, and Louis XV did not disappoint. He racked up a list of lovers longer than any other French king, numbering over 50 and closer to 100 by some estimates. and he fathered at least 13 illegitimate children. The king didn't enjoy being made to feel guilty about committing the cardinal sin of adultery, so he stopped going to confession. Madame de Pompadour died at 42, and Louis was devastated. He locked himself in his room for weeks. He spent more time with his long-suffering wife, Queen Marie, but 4 years later, she was on her deathbed as well. Masses were being said every day for the Queen's soul, as the melancholy king was leaving the chapel and walking through the Hall of Mirrors. He happened to look up and see the most striking pair of violet-blue eyes. Rather than lower her gaze and bow, Jeanne boldly smiled back at the king, captivating his attention. His Majesty inquired as to the identity of the stunning young woman. His valet, Dominique Lebel, who was also his unofficial procurer, brought Jeanne to the king's boudoir. According to legend, when she arrived, she paid the king his due respect by curtsying 3 times. Then she boldly walked up to him and kissed him full on the lips. This story is likely apocryphal, but whatever went on in the king's bedchamber that night, Louis left smitten with Jeanne. His Majesty apparently told the Duc de Noailles that she had introduced him to pleasures he had never known before. The Duke replied, "Sire, that is because your Majesty has never been in a brothel." Lebel couldn't tell the king that his new paramour was actually a common sex worker, so he lied and said that she was a married woman from a noble family. He expected that the king would quickly grow bored and move on. However, when Queen Marie died, Louis was grief-stricken, not only by her loss, but also by his own aging and the death of 5 of their 10 children, including his son and heir, Louis le Dauphin. Jeanne was the only person who could reach him in his misery and lighten his mood. The king became all the more enamored with her, and Lebel was forced to come clean with her true identity. Louis insisted that his lover be married at once so that they could continue their affair in a more proper context. Jean-Baptiste would have been happy to wed her himself, but he was already married, so he proposed a union with his younger brother, Guillaume. He was short, overweight, alcohol-dependent, and had been discharged from the army because of poor health. He had few other prospects, so he agreed to marry a woman whose bed he would never share, in exchange for being named Comte de Louis Jourdan and getting a major estate in Gascony. Jean-Baptiste also made out well. In exchange for an impressive estate in Champagne, he forged a false birth certificate for Jeanne, which invented a fictitious line of noble descent and made her 3 years younger than she actually was. Apparently, a 25-year-old woman was getting a bit long in the tooth for a 58-year-old king. Jeanne was installed in a luxurious apartment above the king's bedchamber, but her life was lonely. Because of the strict protocol of Versailles, she could not be seen with His Majesty in public, and none of the nobility were willing to befriend or even acknowledge her. Everyone knew that she was a woman of the street who presumed above her station. In order to become the king's official mistress, she would have to be presented at court, and she needed a genuine member of the nobility to sponsor her. Her old friend Richelieu came to her aid. He knew that Madame de Bern was drowning in gambling debts, so he offered to pay them off if she would do him the small favor of ruining her reputation by sponsoring the king's mistress. She agreed, but she was so nervous that at the first planned presentation, she panicked and feigned a sprained ankle. Before the second, the king fell off his horse, broke his arm, and had to cancel. By the third attempt, Jeanne would not allow anything to go wrong. She kept the gossiping court waiting while she had her spectacular coiffure perfected. When she was ready, she strutted into the Hall of Mirrors in a spectacular silvery white gown, brocaded with gold, with the largest side panniers ever seen in France. Around her neck, wrists, and at her delicate earlobes, she wore diamonds which her royal lover had sent her the night before. The stunning Madame Jeanne du Barry was officially introduced to the king, whom she already knew intimately. Jeanne quickly grew accustomed to living in luxury. Hot chocolate was brought to her in bed every morning. She dressed in the finest clothes and had her own hairdresser to powder her curls. She received visits from the owners of the finest fashion and jewel houses, who were eager to sell her their best wares. She became patron of several artists and collected paintings. Louis gifted her a young enslaved man named Zamor, who was from Bangladesh. She dressed him elegantly and educated him. Jeanne was extravagant and good-natured. She did well by those who treated her with respect. Her old sponsor, Madame du Barry, came to her to beg a favor. Her friends, the Comte and Comtesse de Lucerne, had been evicted from their chateau for gambling debts. When the bailiff and police officer came to remove them, the Comtesse shot them both dead. Now the de Lucernes were both sentenced to beheading. Jeanne went to the king, got on her knees, and begged for their lives, refusing to get up until they were pardoned. Louis was moved and replied, "Madame, I am delighted that the first favor you should ask of me should be an act of mercy." Jeanne also wrote a letter to the Chancellor of France to save the life of a young girl who had been condemned to the gallows for infanticide after she concealed the birth of a stillborn child. Jeanne still had plenty of enemies at court, but few so bitter as the Duchess du Gramont. She had tried desperately to snare the king's interest before Jeanne appeared on the scene. She jealously published libel pamphlets about her relationship with the king. Another rival was the Duc de Choiseul, who resented Jeanne's influence over His Majesty. Louis felt his country was exhausted by war, but the Duke, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, wanted more glorious and enriching battle. He plotted to instigate a conflict with England over the Falkland Islands. Part of his plan was to distract the king with a new mistress, Albertine Elizabeth Peter. Louis did succumb to her charms, but Jeanne learned of the Duke's plot and revealed it to the king on Christmas Eve. The Duke was exiled, and Louis dropped Albertine Elizabeth and returned his full devotion to Jeanne. The most notable personage to snub Jeanne was Marie Antoinette, the young wife of Louis's grandson and heir, Dauphin Louis Auguste. The Austrian princess refused to acknowledge the king's commoner mistress, deeply wounding her. Jeanne complained to Louis, who in turn advised the Austrian ambassador that it was in Marie Antoinette's best interest to get off her high horse and do right by the king's favorite. On New Year's Day, 1772, Marie Antoinette approached Jeanne and said, "There are a lot of people at Versailles today." The small interaction sufficed, and the crisis came to an end. Unlike her predecessor, Madame de Pompadour, Madame du Barry had little interest in politics. The king still craved her advice, and even invited her to council meetings. But she preferred to wait for him to spoil her with fine clothes and diamonds. The funds he lavished upon her made her unpopular with the people, and despite a staggering allowance, she was perpetually in debt, at one point up to 300,000 livres, or about $8 million. The king ordered his love a necklace, the like of which had never been seen before. It contained 647 flawless diamonds, at an estimated cost of 2 million livres, or $50 million, but it was not finished before Louis died. Jeanne and Louis had 6 happy years together. By 1774, he began to meditate on his impending mortality. While staying with Jeanne at Le Petit Trianon, he experienced the first symptoms of smallpox. He was brought back to his own bed in the palace, and Jeanne and his daughters sat vigil at his bedside for days. This was no small sacrifice for a woman whose livelihood depended on her beauty. If she contracted the disease and managed to survive, she might be disfigured for life. On the 4th of May, the king asked Jeanne to leave him, both to protect her from infection and so that he could prepare his conscience for his final confession and receiving the last rites. Jeanne bid Louis farewell and left the room calmly, but once outside his door, she fainted and had to be carried to her own room, where she wept all night. The next day, she moved to a nearby chateau. The king asked for her once more, but when he was informed that she had already left, he replied, "What, already?" and burst into tears. Louis XV died at 3:15 in the morning on May 10, 1774. His 4 daughters were by his side. His 19-year-old grandson was crowned King Louis XVI. His new queen, Marie Antoinette, convinced him to banish Jeanne to a convent. The nuns treated the scandalous former royal mistress coldly, but they soon warmed to her charm and good nature. Slowly, she was permitted to leave during the day, but had to return at night. However, over time, the royal family forgot their resentment, and Jeanne was able to return to her beloved Château de Louveciennes, which had been a gift from the king. She was now in her early 30s and set herself up in comfort. She kept the diamonds, pearls, and jewels the king had given her, estimated to be worth about $100 million, concealed in her bedroom and buried in the garden. She had love affairs with 2 men, Louis Hercule du Cossey-Broussac and British diplomat Henry Seymour of Redland. Seymour, who was married with children, was furious when he learned that he was not the only man in Jeanne's life. He sent her a painting with the words, "Leave me alone," scrawled in English at the bottom. Louis Hercule, who was French after all, was unfazed by the ménage à trois and continued his romance with Jeanne. While she was enjoying a relatively quiet, happy life of luxury, France was falling apart. The many ruinous wars fought by Louis XIV and XV, their lavish lifestyles, including the buckets of money they spent on their mistresses, and the aristocracy and clergy's refusal to relinquish financial privileges, pushed the nation to the brink of ruin. Queen Marie Antoinette became a scapegoat for the ills of France and was labeled Madame Deficit. In 1784, her tarnished reputation was obliterated by the affair of the necklace. The diamond necklace of unrivaled extravagance, which Louis XV had ordered for Jeanne shortly before his death, was finally complete. But the king had never paid for it, and the jewelers had taken on incredible debt to fill the royal commission. Louis XVI offered it to Marie Antoinette, but she refused, saying, "We have more need of 74 ships than a necklace." A woman named Jeanne du Valois Saint-Remy, a courtesan just like Madame du Barry had once been, saw a way to turn the situation to her own advantage. She became the lover of the Cardinal de Rohan, who had offended the queen and was desperate to get back in her good graces. Du Valois wrote a letter to the cardinal pretending to be the queen and convinced him that he would be forgiven if he fronted the money to buy her the necklace. She even arranged a secret nighttime rendezvous in the gardens of Versailles and hired a sex worker to pose as the queen. Once in possession of the extravagant jewel, Du Valois picked it apart and sold the diamonds on the black market. When the cardinal came to the actual queen and asked for the return of the loan he had fronted for the necklace, Marie Antoinette had no idea what he was talking about, and the plot fell apart. Though the queen had been a victim in this con, her reputation was left in tatters, as the people had every reason to believe that she would have coveted the fabulous necklace. All of these surmounting problems led to the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. An angry mob marched to Versailles, arrested the king and queen, and took them back to Paris as prisoners. By 1792, the monarchy was abolished and the First French Republic was proclaimed. Upon returning home from Mass one day, Jeanne discovered that her bedroom had been ransacked, and her jewelry, the only wealth keeping her from falling back into a life of poverty, had been stolen. She gave a detailed list of the missing items to police and jewelry dealers, and the thieves were tracked down in London. But France and Britain had no extradition, so Jeanne had to make repeated trips across the channel to ensure the return of her jewels. Until this point, the leaders of the revolution had largely forgotten about the former mistress of the long-dead king. Jeanne might have lived out her life unnoticed, but her repeated trips to England raised suspicion. Many aristocrats were attempting to immigrate in order to flee the revolution, and the new leaders wanted to keep them and their money in the country to face justice. It didn't help Jeanne's reputation when, after the execution of King Louis XVI, she wore black in mourning. The Republic declared immigration a treasonous offense, punishable by confiscation of property. Jeanne's beloved Château de Lucienne was compounded, and when she learned the news, she raced back to France to justify her stay in England. Upon her return, she learned that her enslaved servant, Zamore, had been inspired by the freedom and equality proposed by the revolution. He had become an officer in the Committee of Public Safety. Jeanne was horrified and expelled him from her home. Zamore promptly denounced her to the committee. But Jeanne had always been good to the people of Louveciennes. They testified on her behalf, and she was allowed to remain in her home. In 1793, the reign of terror gripped the nation. Massacres and mass executions, sped along by the demonically efficient new invention, the guillotine, flooded the streets of Paris with blood. No aristocrats were safe as angry mobs lashed out. Late one night, Jeanne heard a drunken crowd approaching her chateau. She peeked out of a window and saw the crowd parading a bloody cloth on a pike. All of a sudden, her window came crashing in. She discovered that the projectile which had been hurled into her home was the severed head of her lover, Louis Hercule. Jeanne fainted. The Surveillance Committee hunted down people who were suspected of the smallest slight against the new republic, and Jeanne's old charge of attempting to immigrate was dragged back up. She was arrested and taken to prison in Paris. Once she was gone, Zamore and her other servants looted her chateau. Before the Revolutionary Tribunal, Jeanne presented evidence of her legitimate reasons for traveling to London, but the jury didn't care. She was found guilty of treason and condemned to death. Desperate to save herself, she offered to reveal the location of gemstones buried in her garden in exchange for her life. But on December 8, 1793, Jeanne, Comtesse du Barry, was taken in a cart with her hands bound behind her back to the Palais de la Révolution. The executioner said that of all the people he had to behead, no one gave him as much trouble as Madame du Barry. Most aristocrats saw it as their duty to go to their deaths with quiet dignity. But Jeanne, who had clawed her way from poverty to aristocracy, fought tooth and nail. Frantic with terror, her eyes bulging, she struggled against the guards and screamed to the watching crowd, "I don't want to die. Please don't let me die." With difficulty, the guards hoisted her onto the scaffold. She clung to their clothes and begged them not to kill her. But they strapped her to the bench underneath the blade, and the executioner grabbed her by the hair to get her head in the correct position. Her last words were, "One more moment, Mr. Executioner, I beg you." But he let the blade drop. Then he picked up her head and presented it to the bloodthirsty crowd. Jeanne du Barry was 50 years old. She was buried in the Madeleine Cemetery with many other victims of the Revolution, including King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. In the end, the ambition which lifted her out of a life of poverty and bought her many years of happiness cut her life short. A special thank you goes to my patron, Demont Tay Drew. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and check out my other history videos. You can also join my Patreon to support my work and get early access to all of my multi-part series. Thank you for watching.